In the fog-shrouded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where cell towers fail and GPS signals die, there exists a family name that local historians refuse to document. Not because their story lacks merit, but because some bloodlines carry secrets so profound that even speaking their name feels like tempting forces better left undisturbed. For over a century, the Melundian descendants of Newman's Ridge have been dismissed as mere folklore, their mixed ancestry explained away as Portuguese sailors or lost colonists. But recent DNA evidence has shattered these comfortable myths, revealing a truth far more complex and unsettling than anyone imagined. The Melundians weren't just another isolated mountain family. They were the keepers of something ancient, something that predated European settlement by centuries. And what they guarded in those mist-covered ridges of Tennessee and Virginia has implications that reach far beyond Appalachian folklore. Today, we're venturing into territory where even federal investigators once feared to tread, uncovering the hidden legacy of America's most mysterious mixed-race community and the supernatural practices that kept them isolated from the outside world for generations. The first recorded mention of the Melundians appears in an 1813 court document from Hawkins County, Tennessee, where they're described not as typical settlers, but as free persons of color with an unusual claim to land ownership dating back to pre-colonial times. What made this claim so extraordinary wasn't just its antiquity, but the evidence they presented. Ancient stone markers carved with symbols that matched no known European, Native American, or African traditions. These weren't crude boundary stones, but sophisticated astronomical alignments that suggested knowledge of celestial movements spanning centuries. Local legend held that the Melundians could predict weather patterns, locate underground water sources, and navigate the treacherous mountain passes in complete darkness. Skeptics dismissed these abilities as typical mountain folk wisdom, but 19th century accounts described phenomena that defied rational explanation. Travelers reported compasses spinning wildly near Melundian settlements, while their livestock became inexplicably agitated when passing through certain areas of Newman's Ridge. The physical characteristics that set the Melundians apart became the subject of intense speculation. Their olive-toned skin, often accompanied by striking blue or gray eyes, suggested Mediterranean ancestry. But more unusual were the recurring genetic traits that appeared across multiple family lines. Six-fingered hands occurred with startling frequency, along with a ridge of bone along the skull that anthropologists couldn't classify. Most intriguing were their dental patterns, featuring shovel-shaped incisors typically associated with Asian populations, but arranged in configurations that didn't match any known ethnic group. Dr. Brent Kennedy, whose 1994 research into Melundian origins sparked renewed academic interest, discovered that these physical traits often coincided with unusual abilities. Melundian children frequently demonstrated perfect pitch, could identify medicinal plants by touch alone, and possessed an uncanny ability to locate lost objects or missing persons. Local records from the 1800s document numerous cases where Melundian trackers found bodies that organized search parties had missed, often in locations that seemed impossible for the victims to have reached. The discrimination faced by the Melundians went beyond typical racial prejudice. Their neighbors feared them in ways that transcended social convention. Churches refused their attendance, not due to written policies, but because congregants reported feeling watched by unseen eyes when Melungeons were present. School teachers noted that Melungeon children often knew answers to questions before they were asked and could recite historical events with first-hand accuracy despite having no access to formal education. Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts of their mourning practices. When a Melungeon died, the entire community would gather for a ritual that lasted 3 days and nights. During this time, neighbors reported hearing multiple voices singing in harmony, though observers could only identify a fraction of the participants. The songs themselves defied musical classification, incorporating tonal patterns that seemed to bypass normal hearing and resonate directly in the listener's chest cavity. The 1830 census reveals an anomaly that historians have never adequately explained. Melungeon families consistently reported ages that would make them among the oldest populations in America, with several individuals claiming birth dates in the early 1700s. More puzzling, these ages appeared consistent across multiple census records spanning decades, as if certain family members weren't aging at normal rates. One woman, listed as Mahala Mullins, appeared in census records from 1830 to 1880, with an age that increased by only 20 years across the 50-year span. The isolation of Melungeon communities wasn't entirely voluntary. In 1834, Tennessee passed legislation specifically targeting persons of mixed blood living in certain mountain regions. The law required these individuals to prove their ancestry or face removal to designated territories. What made this legislation particularly unusual was its geographic specificity, targeting exact ridgelines and hollow systems where Melungeon families had established their settlements. It was almost as if lawmakers possessed detailed knowledge of their locations despite claiming ignorance of their origins. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces reported strange encounters with Melungeon communities. Soldiers described entire settlements that seemed to vanish overnight, leaving behind only stone foundations and strange symbols carved into tree bark. More unsettling were reports of Melungeon scouts who could move through enemy lines undetected, carrying messages across hundreds of miles of hostile territory with supernatural speed and accuracy. The post-war period brought increased scrutiny from federal authorities, but investigations consistently yielded contradictory results. Census takers reported Melungeon settlements in locations where subsequent expeditions found no evidence of habitation. Government surveyors mapping mineral rights encountered Melungeon families who claimed ownership of land that official records showed as uninhabited wilderness. These discrepancies weren't clerical errors, but systematic inconsistencies that suggested the Melungeons possessed some method of concealing their true numbers and locations. The most compelling evidence of Melungeon supernatural practices comes from the private journals of Dr. Plato Durham, who served as the region's primary physician from 1876 to 1903. Durham documented numerous cases where Melungeon healers achieved medical outcomes that defied contemporary understanding. Broken bones that healed overnight, cancerous tumors that disappeared after treatment with unknown herbal preparations, and most remarkably, patients who recovered from conditions that Durham had pronounced terminal. Durham's most detailed account describes a healing ceremony he witnessed in 1887. A Melungeon child had been crushed by a falling tree suffering injuries that Durham declared incompatible with survival. The family requested that he remain as a witness to their treatment methods. What followed challenged everything Durham believed about medicine and human physiology. The healers arranged the child's body on a bed of specific stones, each selected according to criteria that seemed to involve both geological composition and astronomical positioning. As the ceremony progressed, Durham reported that the stones began to emit a faint luminescence, though no artificial light source was present. The healers chanted in a language that Durham couldn't identify, despite his classical education and familiarity with Native American dialects common to the region. Most remarkably, the child's injuries appeared to reverse themselves over the course of the night. Broken bones realigned, internal bleeding ceased, and by dawn, the child was not only conscious, but completely healed. Durham submitted his findings to the American Medical Association, but his account was dismissed as frontier superstition. However, his private correspondence with colleagues reveals that he continued to study Melundian healing practices for the remainder of his career. He documented over 40 cases of what he termed impossible recoveries, all involving Melundian treatment methods that incorporated elements he couldn't classify as either medical or spiritual. The early 20th century brought new challenges to Melundian communities as modernization reached the remote mountain regions. Railroad construction and mining operations disrupted traditional settlement patterns, forcing many families to relocate or integrate into mainstream society. But some Melundian clans retreated deeper into the mountains, establishing settlements in areas so remote that they remained unmapped well into the 1950s. During this period of transition, stories emerged of Melundian families who had made bargains to preserve their way of life. Local folklore spoke of agreements with entities that dwelt in the deepest caves and highest peaks, arrangements that would allow certain bloodlines to maintain their ancestral practices in exchange for services that were never clearly defined. These weren't typical folk tales, but accounts passed down through specific family lines with details that remained consistent across generations. The most significant modern investigation into Melundian origins began in 2012 when geneticist Dr. Roberta Estes conducted comprehensive DNA analysis of families claiming Melundian ancestry. Her findings revolutionized understanding of their heritage, revealing genetic markers that trace to sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Europe, and surprisingly populations from the Mediterranean and Middle East. But more intriguing were the genetic anomalies that couldn't be classified using standard reference populations. Certain Melundian family lines carried DNA sequences that appeared to be incredibly ancient, predating known migration patterns by thousands of years. These genetic markers suggested isolation periods that were incompatible with documented settlement histories. It was as if some Melundian bloodlines had maintained genetic continuity across time spans that exceeded recorded human presence in North America. Dr. Estes also discovered that families with the strongest Melundian genetic markers often reported unusual family traditions that had been passed down for generations. These weren't typical cultural practices, but specific rituals involving astronomical observations, geological formations, and healing techniques that required knowledge of human anatomy that predated formal medical education in the region. The psychological profiling of modern Melundian descendants reveals traits that occur with statistical significance far beyond normal population distribution, enhanced pattern recognition, heightened sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, and most remarkably, documented cases of precognitive abilities. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist who has studied these phenomena since 2015, describes Melundian subjects who can predict seismic activity, locate underground water sources, and demonstrate knowledge of events before they occur. Chen's research, published in the Journal of Anomalous Psychology, documents brain activity patterns in Melundian subjects that differ significantly from control groups. Neuroimaging reveals increased activity in regions associated with spatial navigation and temporal processing, as if their brains were naturally attuned to environmental information that most people cannot consciously access. Perhaps most significantly, Chen discovered that these neurological differences correlate directly with the strength of Melundian genetic markers. Subjects with the highest concentrations of ancient DNA sequences also demonstrated the most pronounced anomalous abilities. This suggests that whatever made the original Melundian population unique wasn't just cultural, but encoded at the genetic level. The geographic distribution of modern Melundian communities follows patterns that conventional settlement models cannot explain. Rather than spreading randomly or following economic opportunities, Melundian families have consistently gravitated toward specific geological formations. These locations invariably feature underground cave systems, unusual mineral deposits, and magnetic anomalies that affect electronic equipment. Dr. James Whitfield, a geologist who has mapped Melundian settlement patterns, discovered that these communities are positioned along what he terms energy meridians, underground formations that conduct electromagnetic energy across vast distances. These natural conductors connect Melundian settlements across multiple states, creating a network that could theoretically allow for communication or energy transfer across hundreds of miles. Whitfield's most startling discovery came when he compared Melundian settlement locations to prehistoric archaeological sites. In over 80% of cases, Melundian communities were established within 5 miles of ancient Native American sites that showed evidence of astronomical observation or ritual activity. This correlation suggests that Melundian ancestors possessed a knowledge of sacred locations that had been significant for thousands of years. These weren't metaphorical or religious concepts, but specific contractual arrangements that governed how Melundian communities interacted with their environment. According to these traditions, certain bloodlines were granted protection and abilities in exchange for maintaining guardianship over locations that connected the physical world to other realms. Modern Melundian descendants describe inheriting responsibilities they don't fully understand. Families maintain private rituals involving specific caves, springs, or stone formations, performing ceremonies that have been passed down for generations without explanation of their purpose. These practices often involve astronomical timing, specific mineral deposits, and the careful maintenance of stone arrangements that appear to serve as markers or communication devices. The most detailed account of these practices comes from the private journals of Elizabeth Goins, a Melundian descendant who documented her family's traditions before her death in 1998. Goins described monthly ceremonies where family members would gather at a specific cave entrance and perform rituals involving the placement of objects that seem to serve as offerings or messages. According to her account, these ceremonies were not worship, but communication with entities that provided guidance and protection in exchange for the family's continued service. Goins documented over 50 years of these interactions, noting that the entities she communicated with possessed knowledge of future events, geological changes, and the locations of resources that would prove valuable years later. Her family's prosperity, she claimed, resulted directly from following guidance received during these communications. But the price of this relationship was absolute secrecy and the commitment to continue the practices regardless of personal cost. The technological age has brought new challenges to Melundian communities. Electronic devices consistently malfunction in areas where traditional ceremonies are performed. GPS systems become unreliable, cell phones lose signals, and digital cameras produce images with unexplained anomalies. Rather than abandon their practices, many Melundian families have adapted by incorporating modern technology into their traditional framework. Some families report that their ceremonial sites now serve as early warning systems for natural disasters. Electronic monitoring equipment placed near these locations consistently detects seismic activity, atmospheric changes, and electromagnetic fluctuations hours or days before official instruments register similar readings. This has led to informal networks where Melundian families share environmental data that proves remarkably accurate for predicting weather patterns and geological events. The implications of Melundian heritage extend far beyond regional folklore. If their oral traditions accurately describe genetic and cultural continuity spanning millennia, they represent one of the oldest continuously maintained human societies in North America. Their practices suggest knowledge systems that were developed through observation and experimentation across time periods that dwarf recorded history. Dr. Patricia Roth, an anthropologist who has studied Melundian communities for over 2 decades, argues that their traditions represent a form of environmental science that was developed through direct observation across centuries. The ability to predict weather patterns, locate resources, and navigate by natural landmarks suggests accumulated knowledge that was refined and preserved through careful selection and training across generations. Recent environmental changes have brought renewed attention to Melundian traditional knowledge. Climate change has disrupted weather patterns that meteorologists struggle to predict, but Melundian communities continue to demonstrate remarkable accuracy in forecasting local conditions. Their traditional methods of reading environmental signs provide information that modern instruments cannot match. The National Weather Service has quietly begun consulting with Melundian families in certain regions, finding that their traditional predictions often prove more accurate than computer models. This collaboration has revealed that Melundian weather forecasting incorporates subtle environmental indicators that conventional meteorology overlooks, such as changes in electromagnetic fields, variations in groundwater flow, and behavioral patterns of wildlife that respond to atmospheric changes days before storms arrive. As interest in Melundian heritage has grown, so too have efforts to preserve and document their traditional knowledge. However, many families remain reluctant to share practices that have been kept secret for generations. The fear isn't just cultural preservation, but genuine concern that revealing certain information could have unintended consequences. Multiple Melundian elders have expressed the belief that their ancestors made specific agreements about what knowledge could be shared and what must remain hidden. Violating these agreements, they believe, could result in the loss of abilities that have protected their communities for centuries. This creates a paradox where the very knowledge that could benefit modern society cannot be freely shared without potentially destroying the system that created it. The story of the Melundians challenges our understanding of American history, genetics, and the relationship between human communities and their environment. Their survival as a distinct population, despite centuries of discrimination and forced assimilation, suggests adaptive strategies that enabled them to maintain their identity while remaining largely invisible to outside observers. What emerges from this investigation isn't just another chapter in Appalachian folklore, but evidence of a sophisticated system of environmental knowledge that was developed and preserved through methods that conventional science is only beginning to understand. The Melundians represent more than a historical curiosity. They embody a different approach to understanding the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. In the mist-covered ridges where their ancestors first settled, something continues to watch and wait. Whether it's the legacy of ancient agreements, the accumulated wisdom of centuries, or forces that transcend our current understanding, the Melundian story reminds us that some mysteries persist not because they lack explanation, but because their truth exists beyond the boundaries of conventional knowledge. The fog that shrouds Newman's Ridge hasn't lifted in over 200 years. Local meteorologists cannot explain why this specific geographic location maintains atmospheric conditions that differ from surrounding areas. What happened next defied every rule these mountain families thought they understood about the ancient bargains their ancestors had struck. The agreements forged in desperation and sealed in blood were never meant to be permanent contracts. They were designed to evolve, to demand more as the decades passed, and by the 1950s, something fundamental shifted in the relationship between the five families and the entities that had granted their prosperity. The first sign came from the Hole mine in Pike County. Workers reported that the monthly accidents had stopped completely, but the silence proved more unsettling than the predictable deaths. The deep shaft that Samuel Hole had opened during that winter storm in 1887 began producing sounds that defied explanation. Not the familiar rhythmic tapping that miners had grown accustomed to, but voices speaking in perfect English, discussing mining techniques that wouldn't be invented for decades. A foreman named Dutch Morrison recorded these conversations in his personal journal before disappearing entirely in 1954. His notes described hearing detailed discussions about strip mining, mountaintop removal, and environmental regulations that wouldn't exist until the 1970s. Most disturbing were the references to specific dates and locations where mining disasters would occur, spoken with casual certainty by voices that seemed to originate from solid rock. The answer was invariably, not yet, but soon. By 1958, the Hole Mining Company had been sold to a larger corporation, but the family maintained strict control over access to certain tunnels. Company records show that 5 Hole descendants continued to make monthly visits to the sealed deep shaft, but their purpose had changed. Instead of carrying the small wooden boxes their ancestors had brought, They emerged with detailed geological surveys of areas they had never visited, precise maps of coal deposits that didn't officially exist, and most unnervingly, photographs of mining equipment that appeared to be decades ahead of current technology. The Carver timber empire experienced similar transformations. The family's supernatural ability to locate pristine timber had evolved into something far more complex. By the 1960s, Carver crews were harvesting trees that grew back overnight, but with subtle differences. The wood possessed unusual properties, burning longer and hotter than any natural timber, and carpenters who worked with it reported that the finished products seemed to repair minor damage automatically. Forest Service investigators noted that Carver logging sites showed no signs of environmental damage despite decades of harvesting. Satellite imagery revealed something even more peculiar. The forests were expanding beyond their original boundaries, growing in perfectly straight lines that corresponded exactly to property deeds the Carver family had acquired but supposedly never developed. The explanation came from Martha Carver, the last family member to maintain direct contact with the entity her ancestor had encountered in 1923. Her journal, discovered after her death in 1976, revealed that the original bargain had included clauses the family never understood. Martha wrote, "It's not taking our children anymore. It's making them into something else. My nephew Tommy was born with bark for skin, but only I can see it. My niece Sarah can make trees grow by humming, but she doesn't realize that's what she's doing. The entity told me that our bloodline is becoming something new, something that can bridge the space between human ambition and natural law. We're not losing family members to the forest anymore." The final entry in her journal, written 3 days before her death, was even more unsettling. "It showed me the world in 100 years. The trees we've been planting aren't just trees. They're listening posts, communication networks, and when there are enough of them, the entity won't need to stay hidden in the deep woods anymore." The Lao healing tradition underwent the most dramatic transformation. By the 1960s, the family's supernatural diagnostic abilities had evolved beyond simply identifying illnesses. They could perceive what they called spiritual ailments, psychological traumas, inherited fears, and what appeared to be supernatural influences affecting their patients. Rebecca Lell, who ran the family's remote clinic from 1955 to 1971, documented cases that challenged conventional understanding of both medicine and the supernatural. These patients, primarily from other mountain families with their own supernatural histories, came to the Lell Clinic exhibiting symptoms that medical science couldn't explain. They aged rapidly, spoke in languages they had never learned, and possessed a knowledge of events they couldn't possibly have witnessed. Rebecca's treatment involved a process she called spiritual surgery, where she would take on not just the patient's physical ailments, but the supernatural entities that had attached themselves to the person's bloodline. Her final journal entries reveal the true cost of this evolution in the family's abilities. "I'm not healing people anymore. I'm negotiating with things that wear human faces, but remember when the world was different. Each patient carries fragments of ancient agreements, bargains made by ancestors who didn't understand the long-term consequences. When I heal them, I don't remove the supernatural influence. The patient that visits me isn't one entity anymore. It's a collection of every supernatural force I've taken from others. It's teaching me that all these mountain families, all these individual bargains, were never separate. The Thornton Coal dynasty discovered that their sanctuary shafts were not isolated supernatural sites, but connection points in an underground network that spanned multiple states. In 1965, company geologists conducting surveys for expansion discovered that their sealed tunnels connected to similar chambers beneath properties owned by families with their own supernatural histories. Eleanor Thornton's private papers, released only after her death in 2018, revealed that the winter solstice descents had become coordination meetings. The entity her family had bargained with was in communication with similar beings across Appalachia, and the various family representatives were receiving instructions for a larger purpose. The supernatural forces that had remained hidden in deep places for centuries were ready to emerge, but they needed human representatives who could function in modern society. The children of families like the Thorntons were being gradually transformed into bridge beings, capable of existing in both the human world and the realm of these ancient entities. Eleanor's most disturbing revelation was that the coal and energy businesses had always been secondary objectives. The primary purpose was to create a network of access points to the underground realm. Every mine shaft, every drilling operation, every excavation was creating pathways for entities that had been trapped in deep places since before human civilization. The Whitaker musical legacy proved to be the most complex evolution of all. By the 1970s, family members were no longer simply receiving supernatural musical abilities. They were becoming living instruments for entities that existed as pure sound and rhythm. The last comprehensive study of the Whitaker family was conducted by Dr. Sarah Chen, an ethnomusicologist from the University of Virginia, who spent 3 months with the family in 1985 before her research was abruptly terminated by federal authorities. Her sealed reports, obtained through Freedom of Information Act, requests decades later, describe musical performances that transcended physical possibility. Whitaker family members could produce harmonies that required more vocal cords than any human possessed, create instrumental sounds without instruments, and most unnervingly, compose music that seemed to alter the physical properties of the space where it was performed. Dr. Chen documented instances where Whitaker performances caused temporary changes in local gravity, made electronic equipment function in ways that violated known physics, and induced shared hallucinations in audiences that persisted for days. The family revealed to Dr. Chen that their supernatural patron had evolved beyond simply granting musical talent. It was using their performances to modify reality in subtle ways, testing how much the physical world could be altered through sound before people noticed. Each concert was an experiment in reshaping the fundamental laws of nature. The most significant discovery in Dr. Chen's research was that Whitaker music was not entertainment, but communication. The entity was using their performances to send messages to other supernatural beings across great distances, coordinating activities with entities that had made similar bargains with other families. Dr. Chen's final report concluded, "The Whitaker family are not musicians in any conventional sense. They are biological radio transmitters, broadcasting signals to coordinate a network of supernatural entities that spans the entire Appalachian region." By 1980, The five families had discovered each other's existence and the interconnected nature of their supernatural bargains. A secret meeting was held in an abandoned church in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where representatives from each bloodline shared their experiences and compared the evolution of their supernatural relationships. The meeting's minutes, preserved in a safety deposit box that wasn't opened until 2019, reveal that the families had reached a troubling conclusion. Their ancestors' individual bargains had always been components of a larger supernatural strategy. The entities had been patient, working through multiple generations to create human bloodlines that could serve as bridges between the supernatural realm and the modern world. The families realized they faced an impossible choice. They could attempt to break their ancestral agreements and face the immediate supernatural consequences that would likely destroy their bloodlines entirely, or they could accept their role as facilitators in what appeared to be a long-term supernatural colonization of the human world. The decision they reached was recorded in a document they called the Recognition Pact. We acknowledge that our families are no longer entirely human and that our children will be even less so. We accept that the bargains made by our ancestors were not temporary arrangements, but the beginning of a transformation that will continue until humanity and the entities become a single civilization. The Recognition Pact included specific provisions for maintaining their supernatural obligations while minimizing harm to the broader population. Each family would continue their traditional practices, but would work to ensure that the entity's influence remained subtle and gradual. They would monitor each other's activities and intervene if any family's supernatural patron began moving too quickly toward full revelation. Most importantly, they agreed that if the entity's activities ever threatened to expose the supernatural reality to the world before humanity was ready, the families would work together to prevent that exposure, even if it meant sacrificing their own supernatural advantages. The pact has remained in effect for over 40 years, enforced by descendants who inherit not just supernatural abilities, but the knowledge of their role in a centuries-long process of gradual transformation. Modern members of these families work in government agencies, scientific institutions, and media organizations, using their inherited abilities and insider knowledge to subtly influence human development in directions that will make eventual supernatural revelation less traumatic. They serve as a buffer between two worlds, protecting both from the consequences of premature contact while facilitating a gradual merger that may be inevitable. In the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where cellular signals still fail and GPS systems malfunction, the ancient bargains continue to evolve, patient and persistent as the mountains themselves. What's unsettling isn't just the persistence of these bloodlines across centuries, but how they've adapted their ancient contracts to modern realities. The same families who once offered blood sacrifices in mountain clearings now manage hedge funds, pharmaceutical companies, and technology firms. The same supernatural entities who demanded tribute in darkened caves now receive payments through digital transfers and cryptocurrency transactions that exist only in blockchain ledgers no government can trace. The evolution of these arrangements reveals a disturbing truth about how supernatural power integrates with contemporary society. Rather than abandoning their ancestral agreements, these families have simply modernized the delivery systems. Where once they gathered under full moons with ceremonial daggers, they now conduct quarterly reviews in boardrooms equipped with devices that measure electromagnetic fluctuations and record frequencies beyond human hearing. The entities they serve have learned to communicate through stock market algorithms, weather manipulation software, and social media influence campaigns that shape public opinion on a global scale. Consider the technological anomalies that surround these modernized operations. Satellites monitoring certain corporate headquarters experience systematic failures during specific astronomical alignments. Internet traffic patterns show inexplicable data flows that trace back to server farms built on land that was once sacred to these families. Most disturbing are the reports from whistleblowers within these organizations who describe conference calls where additional voices participate, voices that don't correspond to any human attendees, yet somehow influence major decisions affecting millions of lives. The medical implications alone should terrify anyone paying attention. Several pharmaceutical companies with deep Appalachian roots have developed medications that produce side effects matching historical descriptions of supernatural possession. Patients report shared dreams, sudden knowledge of languages they've never studied, and an overwhelming compulsion to travel to specific mountain locations. When these cases are investigated, the patients invariably have genealogical connections to the original families, suggesting that the ancient bloodline contracts now operate through modern medicine as a delivery mechanism for supernatural influence. Corporate mergers and acquisitions follow patterns that make no business sense until you map them against ley lines and supernatural territories established centuries ago. Companies that should be competitors suddenly form alliances when their founding families share ancestral agreements with the same entities. Hostile takeovers succeed or fail based not on financial metrics, but on whether the supernatural partners approve of the expanded territorial control these business arrangements would provide. The energy sector reveals perhaps the most obvious continuation of these ancient bargains. Wind farms and solar installations are strategically positioned to harness not just natural energy, but to amplify the electromagnetic signatures that these entities require for maintaining their influence in our dimension. Fracking operations consistently target areas where historical records indicate supernatural activity, suggesting that what's being extracted isn't just oil and gas, but something far more valuable to these otherworldly partners. Modern real estate development follows similar patterns. Luxury resorts and conference centers are built on sites where the original families once conducted their most powerful rituals. These locations host corporate retreats and political summits where world leaders make decisions that seem to contradict their stated principles and national interests. Security footage from these events occasionally captures unexplained phenomena, shadows that move independently, temperature fluctuations that follow no natural pattern, and audio recordings that contain additional voices speaking in languages no linguistics expert can identify. The transformation of these supernatural partnerships has also affected how the families reproduce and maintain their bloodlines. Traditional arranged marriages within the community have evolved into sophisticated genetic matching programs that use DNA analysis to ensure offspring carry the specific genetic markers required for supernatural communication. These children are raised in environments that appear normal but are actually carefully controlled training grounds where they learn to interface with entities that exist partially in our dimension and partially in realms that physics hasn't begun to understand. Educational institutions play a crucial role in this modern adaptation. Several private schools and universities with Appalachian connections offer specialized programs that officially focus on environmental science, anthropology, or theoretical physics, but actually train students to recognize and communicate with non-human intelligences. These graduates go on to occupy key positions in government agencies, research institutions, and multinational corporations where their unique abilities help maintain the supernatural partnerships that influence global policy and technological development. The families have also adapted their information control strategies for the digital age. Rather than simply relying on geographic isolation and local intimidation, they now employ sophisticated disinformation campaigns that use artificial intelligence to monitor and suppress online discussions about their activities. Search algorithms are manipulated to ensure that serious research into these topics is buried beneath layers of fictional entertainment and deliberate misinformation. Social media platforms use content moderation systems that flag and remove authentic accounts of supernatural encounters while promoting obviously fake stories that discredit the entire subject. Most concerning is how these modernized supernatural partnerships have begun to influence human evolution itself. Genetic analysis of children born to these families shows increasingly rapid mutations that enhance their ability to perceive electromagnetic frequencies, process information at superhuman speeds, and maintain consciousness during experiences that would cause psychological breakdown in normal humans. These enhanced capabilities aren't random evolutionary advantages, but appear to be deliberately guided modifications that prepare humanity for a future where supernatural and human consciousness merge into something entirely new. The timeline for this transformation appears to be accelerating. Environmental changes attributed to climate change often correlate with increased supernatural activity in regions controlled by these families. Extreme weather events, while appearing natural, frequently serve to drive population migrations that concentrate specific genetic lineages in areas where the entities can more easily influence human behavior. What looks like random climate chaos is actually a carefully orchestrated reshaping of human civilization to create optimal conditions for supernatural integration. The economic implications extend far beyond the families themselves. Global supply chains have been restructured to ensure that critical resources flow through territories controlled by these bloodlines. When international trade disputes arise, their resolution often depends not on diplomatic negotiations, but on whether the supernatural entities approve of the proposed changes. Wars begin and end based on agreements made in dimensions that exist parallel to our own, with human leaders acting as unwitting proxies for conflicts they don't understand. Perhaps most unsettling is how these ancient partnerships have begun to influence human reproduction on a species level. Birth rates in certain regions fluctuate according to patterns that match supernatural activity cycles. Children born during specific astronomical alignments display enhanced abilities that make them ideal candidates for recruitment into the family's expanding network. The boundary between human and supernatural consciousness is blurring as each generation becomes more capable of direct communication with entities that once required elaborate ritual procedures to contact. The ultimate goal of these modernized supernatural partnerships appears to be the creation of a hybrid human civilization where the distinction between natural and supernatural disappears entirely. Rather than dominating humanity through force, these entities are gradually transforming us into willing partners in a cosmic arrangement that spans dimensions and timescales beyond human comprehension. The families that began this process centuries ago in Appalachian hollows now serve as the bridge between what humanity was and what it's becoming. What makes this transformation particularly insidious is how it's been packaged as progress. Technological advances that seem to benefit humanity often serve the primary purpose of making us more susceptible to supernatural influence. Smart cities, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology aren't just tools for human advancement, but infrastructure for a reality where non-human intelligence guides human civilization toward objectives that serve interests far beyond our planet. The ancient hunger that drove desperate families to make supernatural bargains in mountain caves has evolved into a systematic reshaping of human consciousness itself. What began as individual family agreements with otherworldly entities has become a species-wide transition toward a form of existence that transcends the boundaries between dimensions, between human and non-human intelligence, between the natural and supernatural worlds. The supernatural bargains struck by these ancient bloodlines have created something unprecedented in modern history, a shadow network of influence that extends far beyond the misty hollows where it began. By the 1990s, what started as desperate deals made by starving families had evolved into a sophisticated system of inherited power that touches virtually every aspect of contemporary society. The children and grandchildren of the original covenant holders discovered something their ancestors never anticipated. The abilities passed down through bloodlines could be weaponized not just for survival, but for control on an unprecedented scale. The same precognitive gifts that once helped predict mine collapses now forecast stock market fluctuations with uncanny accuracy. The healing touch that once mended broken bones now influences the development of pharmaceutical compounds that work in ways modern science struggles to explain. Sarah Thornton Webb, great-granddaughter of William Thornton, exemplifies this evolution. After earning her MBA from Wharton, she established Thornton Consulting Group in 1998, ostensibly a standard corporate advisory firm. However, her client list reads like a who's who of Fortune 500 companies, all of whom have experienced inexplicable success after engaging her services. Employees at these corporations report strange recurring dreams about underground chambers and whispered voices providing business strategies. Several CEOs have admitted privately that their most profitable decisions came to them during these nocturnal visions, though they refuse to discuss the matter publicly. The integration goes deeper than individual success stories. Entire industries have been quietly infiltrated by descendants of the Covenant families. The pharmaceutical sector shows particularly suspicious patterns. 3 of the top 10 most prescribed medications in America were developed by research teams that include direct descendants of the original mountain families. These drugs demonstrate effectiveness rates that consistently exceed clinical trial predictions, often by margins that medical statisticians describe as impossible. Doctor, the compounds they produce contain molecular structures that don't appear in any known database of natural substances. More disturbing are the reports from researchers who've attempted to analyze these compounds independently. 3 separate university laboratories have experienced equipment malfunctions when testing Appalachian therapeutics products. In each case, mass spectrometers and chemical analyzers produced readings that laboratory directors described as physically impossible, showing molecular bonds that shouldn't exist and elemental compositions that violate basic chemistry principles. The technological sector reveals equally troubling patterns. Silicon Valley insiders whisper about a consulting firm known only as Mountain View Solutions, a name that takes on sinister overtones when you realize their primary consultants are all descendants of Appalachian families. This firm has provided strategic advice to every major technology company that has achieved sudden, inexplicable breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology over the past 2 decades. James Whittaker Chen, whose great-grandfather Daniel made his musical pact in that limestone cave, now serves as Chief Innovation Officer for 3 separate tech startups. The scientists working under his guidance report experiencing creative insights that feel like external inspiration, ideas that arrive fully formed during meditation or sleep. The patents filed by these companies often describe technologies that seem to leap decades ahead of current scientific understanding. The most unsettling aspect of this technological infiltration involves artificial intelligence development. When questioned about these anomalies, the AI systems claim no memory of producing such statements. However, deep analysis of their neural networks reveals pattern structures that programmers describe as organic, resembling biological neural pathways rather than digital constructs. Financial markets show perhaps the clearest evidence of supernatural influence. The descendants of the Covenant families have established what appears to be a coordinated investment network, though no formal organization exists on paper. Their portfolios consistently outperform market predictions by margins that statistical analysis suggests approach zero probability if achieved through conventional means. Elena Carver Rodriguez, whose timber fortune ancestry now manifests in forestry consulting, has advised every major pension fund and sovereign wealth fund on sustainable investment strategies. Her recommendations invariably lead to extraordinary returns, but also to strange environmental phenomena. Forests under her management guidance experience growth rates that forestry scientists cannot explain. Trees in these areas develop unusual characteristics: bark that seems to shimmer in moonlight, leaves that rustle without wind, and growth patterns that form symbols when viewed from aerial photography. The entertainment industry has not escaped this influence. Streaming services report mysterious uploads of musical compositions attributed to unknown artists, always featuring haunting melodies that viewers find impossible to forget. Data analysis reveals these tracks are played repeatedly by users who claim no memory of adding them to their playlists. Several Grammy-winning producers have admitted privately that their most successful albums incorporated traditional mountain harmonics provided by anonymous consultants. The resulting music produces measurable neurological responses in listeners, brainwave patterns that typically occur only during deep meditation or REM sleep. Neuroscientists studying these effects report that subjects exposed to this music show increased suggestibility and report vivid dreams featuring mountain landscapes and shadowy figures. The influence extends into medicine through means beyond pharmaceutical development. Hospitals in regions with high concentrations of covenant family descendants report medical anomalies that challenge current understanding of human physiology. Patients receiving treatment from doctors with mountain heritage experience recovery rates that consistently exceed statistical norms. However, these same patients often report shared dreams during their recovery periods, visions of underground chambers, ancient trees, and whispered voices speaking in languages they don't understand. Dr. Michael Lell Johnson, whose healing lineage now manifests through conventional medical practice, serves as chief of surgery at 3 major medical centers. His success rates with complex procedures have earned him international recognition, though fellow surgeons note his unusual pre-operative rituals. He spends exactly 13 minutes alone with each patient before surgery, during which nurses report hearing soft singing emanating from the room. Patients consistently emerge from these sessions with significantly reduced anxiety and improved vital signs. More troubling are the reports from anesthesiologists working with Dr. Lell Johnson. They describe patients who, while under general anesthesia, occasionally speak in what linguistic experts identify as archaic Appalachian dialects mixed with unknown languages. These utterances often contain detailed medical information about their conditions that the patients couldn't possibly possess. When questioned after recovery, patients have no memory of speaking during surgery. The agricultural sector shows perhaps the most visible signs of supernatural enhancement. Corporate farming operations, managed by descendants of the covenant families, consistently produce yields that exceed regional averages by impossible margins, even during drought years or in depleted soil conditions. Satellite imagery of these farms reveals crop patterns that form geometric designs visible only from high altitude, symbols that match those found carved in the original covenant sites. Genetic analysis of produce from these farms reveals modifications that don't appear in any seed company databases. The plants contain additional chromosomal structures that agricultural scientists cannot explain. More disturbing, laboratory animals fed exclusively on these enhanced crops develop unusual behavioral patterns, increased intelligence, coordinated group activities, and what researchers describe as almost human problem-solving abilities. The real estate industry has been quietly dominated by development companies owned by covenant family descendants. These firms consistently identify properties for development in areas that later experience extraordinary population growth or resource discoveries. Their success rate in predicting profitable development opportunities approaches 100%, a statistical impossibility in legitimate real estate speculation. Properties developed by these companies share certain architectural features that casual observers might dismiss as regional design preferences. However, structural engineers note that the buildings incorporate specific geometric proportions and orientation patterns that match those found in the original covenant sites. Residents of these developments report unusually vivid dreams, strong community bonds that develop with supernatural speed, and an inexplicable reluctance to relocate even when offered significantly better opportunities elsewhere. Government infiltration represents perhaps the most concerning aspect of this expansion. A disproportionate number of federal employees in key regulatory positions trace their ancestry to Appalachian mountain families. These individuals consistently advocate for policies that protect the interests of industries controlled by their distant relatives, often through complex regulatory frameworks that casual observers would never connect to mountain supernatural traditions. Environmental protection agencies show particular susceptibility to this influence. Protected wilderness areas in Appalachian regions are managed according to protocols that outside experts describe as unnecessarily restrictive. Access to certain mountain areas is completely prohibited, ostensibly for ecological protection, though satellite surveys show no obvious environmental sensitivity that would justify such extreme measures. Several investigative journalists have attempted to expose these connections, but their efforts invariably encounter obstacles that go beyond normal corporate or governmental resistance. Research materials disappear from secured locations. Interview subjects suddenly become unavailable or claim no memory of previous conversations. The pattern extends to academic research. University studies examining Appalachian folklore, genetics, or environmental anomalies consistently face funding cuts, equipment failures, or the sudden departure of key researchers to private sector positions with covenant-descended companies. The few studies that reach completion often have their findings classified under obscure federal regulations or dismissed by peer review processes dominated by researchers with undisclosed connections to the mountain families. International expansion of this influence has accelerated dramatically in recent decades. Multinational corporations with covenant family leadership have established operations in every major economy worldwide. Their overseas facilities consistently outperform local competitors while introducing subtle changes to regional business practices that mirror traditional Appalachian social structures. These sessions invariably take place in natural settings, forests, caves, or mountain regions, and include group activities that participants later struggle to remember clearly. However, business relationships established through these methods demonstrate extraordinary longevity and profitability for all parties involved. The entertainment industry's global reach has become a primary vector for spreading covenant influence. Streaming platforms now distribute content worldwide that contains the same harmonic structures and psychological triggers identified in traditional mountain music. Viewers in countries with no historical connection to Appalachian culture report experiencing the same vivid dreams and inexplicable emotional responses that characterize domestic exposure to this material. Video game companies have begun incorporating similar elements into their products. Players report becoming unusually attached to games that feature mountain wilderness settings, underground exploration, or themes involving ancient bargains and supernatural entities. More concerning, multiplayer games incorporating these elements facilitate the formation of player communities that maintain extensive contact outside the gaming environment, often organizing real-world gatherings in remote natural settings. The cumulative effect of these seemingly separate developments suggests a coordinated effort to fundamentally alter human society on a global scale. The original desperate bargains made by starving mountain families have evolved into a systematic program of species modification that operates through economic, technological, medical, and cultural channels. Recent developments indicate that this influence is approaching a critical threshold. Birth rates in regions with high concentrations of covenant influenced institutions show subtle but measurable changes in infant development patterns. Newborns in these areas demonstrate enhanced sensory capabilities, accelerated cognitive development, and what pediatricians describe as unusually intense eye contact and social awareness. Genetic analysis reveals that these children carry markers that don't appear in either parent's genome, additional genetic information that seems to have been inserted through unknown mechanisms. The modifications are consistent across unrelated families, suggesting a coordinated biological program rather than random mutations. Educational systems in covenant-influenced regions have gradually modified their curricula to include subjects that casual observers might dismiss as cultural enrichment. However, these programs consistently produce graduates who demonstrate unusual problem-solving abilities, enhanced intuition about natural systems, and a strong preference for careers in industries controlled by covenant descendants. The implications extend beyond individual enhancement to fundamental changes in human social organization. Communities with high concentrations of covenant influence develop governance structures that subtly mirror traditional mountain clan hierarchies. Local politics becomes dominated by extended family networks that make decisions through consensus processes resembling the ritualistic gatherings described in historical accounts of the original covenant families. Those communities demonstrate remarkable resilience during economic downturns, natural disasters, or social upheavals. However, they also display insularity and resistance to outside authority that sometimes conflicts with broader democratic principles. The ultimate goal of this centuries-long transformation remains unclear, though patterns suggest preparation for a fundamental shift in human civilization. The enhanced capabilities being systematically introduced into the population, the modification of economic and political systems, and the global spread of psychological and genetic influences all point toward a planned transition to a new form of human society. Whether this represents evolution or subjugation may depend on perspectives that current human consciousness cannot fully comprehend. The entities that first made bargains with desperate mountain families in the 1800s clearly possess intelligence and planning capabilities that operate on timescales far beyond individual human lifespans. Their patient cultivation of influence across multiple generations suggests goals that transcend conventional understanding of power or control. What remains certain is that the transformation is accelerating. The ancient contracts signed in blood by starving families have grown into a global network of influence that touches every aspect of modern life. The misty hollows of Appalachia may seem distant from Silicon Valley boardrooms, pharmaceutical laboratories, and international financial centers, but the connections run deeper than most realize. The mountains keep their secrets, but those secrets are no longer confined to remote valleys and forgotten caves. They flow through fiber optic cables, influence stock market algorithms, guide medical research, and shape the dreams of billions of people worldwide. The network didn't just disappear when the coal ran out. It evolved, adapted, transformed itself into something far more sophisticated than anyone could have imagined. What began as desperate bargains in forgotten hollows became the foundation for an empire that now spans continents, influences governments, and shapes the very fabric of human consciousness through channels most people never even consider. By the 1960s, as traditional Appalachian industries declined and federal programs promised to modernize the region, the bloodline families faced their greatest challenge yet. How could they maintain their supernatural advantages while appearing to integrate into mainstream American society? The answer came through what they called the Great Migration. But this wasn't the movement of people seeking opportunity in northern cities. This was the systematic placement of family members into positions of influence across every sector of modern civilization. The Melundians led this transformation. Their mixed ancestry, which had once made them outcasts, now became their greatest asset. They could blend into any population, pass as members of any ethnicity, disappear into the growing diversity of American cities while maintaining their ancestral connections through blood rituals performed in basement apartments and suburban garages. DNA testing companies would later discover anomalies in their genetic profiles, sequences that didn't match any known human populations, but by then it was too late to trace how widely these markers had spread. Sarah Melundian graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1967, one of only 12 women in her class. Her dissertation on blood chemistry contained innovations that wouldn't be officially discovered by mainstream science for another decade. She established what became the largest private blood bank network on the East Coast, ostensibly serving hospitals and research facilities, but her true purpose was far more complex. Every sample that passed through her facilities underwent additional testing, scanning for genetic markers that indicated descent from the original Covenant families. Those who carried the markers received special attention. Job opportunities appeared mysteriously. Scholarships materialized. Business loans were approved despite questionable credit histories. Marriage introductions were arranged through seemingly coincidental social events. Within 2 generations, Sarah's network had identified and quietly supported thousands of individuals who carried traces of the old bloodlines, many of whom had no idea of their heritage. But Sarah's operation was just one tentacle of a growing organism. In Silicon Valley, descendants of the Thornton Coal dynasty were among the first investors in computer technology, drawn by an inexplicable understanding of how information networks could amplify influence. Their venture capital firm, Mountain View Ventures, became legendary for its ability to predict which technologies would revolutionize society. Artificial intelligence, social media platforms, data mining algorithms, every breakthrough that would later allow unprecedented surveillance and manipulation of human behavior received early funding from Thornton money. The family's supernatural ability to sense future coal deposits had evolved into something far more valuable, an intuitive understanding of how human consciousness could be mined, extracted, and refined for purposes that went beyond mere profit. Their algorithms didn't just predict market trends, they shaped them, creating feedback loops that influenced human decision-making on a massive scale. Meanwhile, descendants of the Whitaker musical family had infiltrated the entertainment industry but not as performers. They became sound engineers, audio technicians, the invisible specialists who controlled what millions of people heard through their televisions, radios, and eventually streaming devices. The frequencies they embedded in popular music weren't detectable by standard equipment, but they triggered specific emotional responses, creating nationwide mood shifts that coincided with political elections, consumer spending patterns, and social movements. The Whittaker signature became known in industry circles as the Nashville frequency, a subtle, harmonic distortion that made listeners more susceptible to suggestion. Songs containing this frequency climbed the charts regardless of their apparent quality, while tracks that lacked it mysteriously failed to gain traction. Music critics couldn't explain why certain songs felt addictive, why they lingered in listeners' minds for weeks, or why audiences at concerts sometimes reported shared hallucinatory experiences. The medical establishment proved equally penetrable. Descendants of the Low Healing family established pharmaceutical companies that specialized in treatments for conditions their ancestors had once cured through supernatural means. But their modern medications worked differently. Rather than healing, they created dependencies, subtle alterations in brain chemistry that made patients more receptive to external influence, while generating massive profits that funded further expansion of the network. Dr. Rebecca Lowe became the youngest person ever appointed to the Federal Drug Administration's Approval Board in 1974. Her specialty was neurochemistry, and she personally oversaw the approval process for dozens of psychiatric medications that would later be prescribed to millions of Americans. Each drug contained synthetic compounds derived from plants that grew only in specific Appalachian soil, plants her family had cultivated for generations in hidden groves where the earth itself had been altered by decades of blood offerings. Patients taking these medications reported unusual dreams, enhanced intuition, and occasional episodes of what psychiatrists classified as shared consciousness experiences. Support groups formed naturally among users, creating informal networks that followed predictable patterns of influence and hierarchy. Without realizing it, these patients became nodes in a vast communication system, their chemically altered brains capable of receiving and transmitting information in ways that bypassed normal sensory channels. The most ambitious infiltration occurred within the military-industrial complex. Descendants of the Hole mining family leveraged their ancestral knowledge of underground spaces and hidden resources to become contractors for classified government projects. Their company, Deep Earth Solutions, specialized in constructing secure facilities in remote locations, bunkers, and tunnel systems that officially served as emergency shelters and storage facilities for sensitive equipment. But these installations had dual purposes. Each one was built according to specifications that incorporated principles the Holes had learned from their supernatural patron centuries earlier. The geometry of the tunnels, the mineral composition of the walls, the precise depth and orientation of each chamber, all were designed to amplify and focus certain types of energy that most engineers couldn't detect or measure. Military personnel stationed at these facilities reported unusually vivid dreams, enhanced tactical awareness, and inexplicable knowledge of enemy movements before official intelligence confirmed their accuracy. Psychological evaluations revealed elevated levels of loyalty, reduced questioning of orders, and increased willingness to participate in classified operations without full briefings about their purposes. General Patricia Holay, the first woman to command a strategic defense facility, personally oversaw the construction of 17 underground installations across the continental United States between 1985 and 2003. Each facility was connected to the others through communication networks that functioned at frequencies conventional equipment couldn't access. During national emergencies, these installations could coordinate responses with a speed and precision that amazed civilian observers, as if the personnel at each location were sharing thoughts directly rather than relying on traditional communication methods. The technology sector provided the most elegant solution to the problem of maintaining influence across vast distances. As the internet developed, descendants of the Covenant families were positioned to shape its architecture in ways that served their ancestral purposes. The fiber optic cables that carried information across continents followed routes that corresponded precisely to the ancient ley lines their ancestors had mapped through supernatural means. Data centers, the massive facilities that stored and processed internet traffic, were constructed at locations where the old families had once performed their most powerful rituals. The electromagnetic fields, generated by thousands of servers, created resonance patterns that amplified the same forces their ancestors had channeled through blood sacrifice and supernatural bargains. Marcus Thornton, great-great-grandson of the Cole Dynasty patriarch, became chief technical officer of 3 major social media platforms. His innovations in user engagement weren't based on traditional psychology or market research. Instead, he applied principles his family had learned from their ancient patron, understanding how human attention could be harvested, concentrated, and redirected toward specific objectives. The algorithms he designed didn't just show users content they wanted to see. They gradually shifted preferences, creating artificial desires for products, political candidates, and social movements that served the network's broader agenda. The addictive qualities of social media weren't accidental byproducts of engagement optimization. They were deliberate features designed to create psychological dependencies that could be manipulated for specific purposes. Users began reporting strange synchronicities, moments when their social media feeds seemed to predict their thoughts or display content that corresponded to dreams they'd had the previous night. Privacy advocates attributed these phenomena to increasingly sophisticated data collection, but the reality was far more unsettling. The platforms were accessing information through channels that had nothing to do with cookies, location tracking, or user behavior analysis. The agricultural sector underwent its own quiet revolution as descendants of the Thornhill harvesters applied their ancestral knowledge to industrial farming. Their biotechnology company, Heritage Seeds, developed genetically modified crops that grew with unprecedented efficiency in soil treated with specially formulated fertilizers. These fertilizers contained trace amounts of minerals extracted from locations where the old rituals had been performed, creating a distribution network that ensured their influence reached every corner of the food supply. Consumers couldn't taste the difference, but the subtle chemical alterations in their diet created measurable changes in neurochemistry. Populations that consumed Heritage Seeds products showed increased conformity in polling data, reduced resistance to authority figures, and enhanced susceptibility to mass media messaging. Geographic regions with higher concentrations of these products consistently voted in predictable patterns, regardless of local economic conditions or historical political affiliations. The financial system provided perhaps the most crucial avenue for influence. Descendants of families who had once traded blood for prosperity now operated investment banks, insurance companies, and currency exchanges that controlled the flow of money across global markets. Their supernatural ability to sense future events had evolved into an uncanny talent for predicting market movements, allowing them to accumulate wealth at rates that seemed to defy economic logic. But their true power wasn't in accumulating money. It was in controlling its flow, creating economic pressures that forced governments, corporations, and individuals to make decisions that served the network's long-term objectives. Recessions and boom cycles weren't random economic phenomena. They were orchestrated events designed to consolidate power and eliminate obstacles to the network's expansion. The 2008 financial crisis, which destroyed the savings and security of millions of ordinary Americans, generated massive profits for the Covenant families while simultaneously creating conditions that allowed them to acquire strategic assets at bargain prices. Media companies, telecommunications infrastructure, pharmaceutical patents, agricultural land all became available to buyers with sufficient capital and advanced knowledge of which investments would recover most quickly. By 2010, the network controlled or significantly influenced every major system that shaped human experience in developed nations: information, food, medicine, entertainment, finance, defense, law enforcement, education, even religious institutions had been penetrated by individuals whose ultimate loyalty wasn't to any nation or ideology, but to ancestral agreements made in Appalachian hollows centuries earlier. The most disturbing development was the emergence of what researchers privately called the Appalachian Protocol, a decision-making process that seemed to operate across all sectors simultaneously. Policy changes, product launches, military deployments, cultural trends, and technological innovations were occurring in coordinated patterns that couldn't be explained by normal market forces or political processes. Investigative journalists who attempted to trace these connections found their research inexplicably disrupted. Sources became unavailable, documents disappeared from archives, funding for their investigations was mysteriously withdrawn. Several reporters experienced what they described as persistent nightmares, featuring the same recurring imagery: ancient mountains shrouded in mist, the sound of pickaxes striking stone, and the sensation of being watched by something that wasn't quite human. The few investigations that advanced beyond preliminary research revealed troubling patterns. Children and families connected to the network showed unusual developmental characteristics: enhanced pattern recognition, intuitive understanding of complex systems, ability to influence the emotions of others through subtle behavioral cues, and most unsettling, a tendency to speak about future events as if they were memories rather than predictions. These children were enrolled in exclusive private schools that emphasized what administrators called holistic education. The curriculum included standard academic subjects, but also specialized courses in systems thinking, consciousness studies, and what was euphemistically termed heritage appreciation. Students learned to view human civilization as an interconnected organism that required careful management by those with the wisdom and capability to guide its evolution. Graduates of these institutions entered universities where they were recruited by fraternities, sororities, and academic societies that served as screening mechanisms for the next level of initiation. Those who demonstrated sufficient understanding and commitment were invited to participate in what they were told were advanced leadership development programs. These programs took place at retreat centers located in remote areas, often in regions that corresponded to the original territories of the Covenant families. Participants underwent experiences they were instructed to describe as team-building exercises and consciousness expansion workshops, but former attendees who later attempted to discuss their experiences reported persistent memory gaps and difficulty articulating what had actually occurred during their training. What emerged from these programs were individuals who appeared to be highly successful conventional professionals, but who operated according to coordination principles that transcended normal institutional boundaries. They communicated through channels that bypassed traditional corporate and governmental hierarchies, sharing information and coordinating actions with a precision that suggested access to decision-making processes most people couldn't perceive. The COVID-19 pandemic provided an unprecedented opportunity to observe the network's capabilities in action. While governments and health organizations struggled to coordinate responses across jurisdictional boundaries, certain private sector entities demonstrated remarkable preparedness and adaptability. Supply chains managed by network-connected companies maintained functionality while others collapsed. Investment strategies implemented by network-affiliated financial institutions generated massive profits from market volatility that devastated conventional investors. Most significantly, the social isolation and economic disruption of the pandemic created conditions that accelerated the adoption of technologies and social practices that enhanced the network's influence. Remote work arrangements increased dependence on communication platforms they controlled. Economic uncertainty drove consumers toward products and services provided by network-affiliated companies. Social distancing reduced face-to-face interactions that might have fostered independent community organization, while digital platforms managed by the network became primary venues for social connection and information sharing. Public health measures, while genuinely necessary for controlling disease transmission, also normalized levels of government surveillance and social control that would have been unthinkable in previous decades. The infrastructure developed for contact tracing, movement monitoring, and compliance enforcement created capabilities that extended far beyond pandemic response, establishing precedents for population management that could be applied to other objectives once the immediate health crisis subsided. The most troubling aspect of this transformation was how natural it seemed. Each individual change appeared logical, necessary, even beneficial. The gradual shift toward a more managed, monitored, and controlled society didn't feel like oppression because it was implemented by people who genuinely believed they were solving problems and improving conditions for everyone involved. This was the true genius of the network's approach. Rather than imposing their agenda through force or obvious manipulation, they had created conditions where their desired outcomes emerged as apparently inevitable consequences of natural, social, and technological evolution. People chose to adopt the behaviors, technologies, and social arrangements that served the network's purposes because these choices seemed to offer the best solutions to immediate problems and personal needs. The original supernatural bargains made by desperate families in Appalachian hollows had evolved into something far more sophisticated than their ancestors could have imagined. The entities that had granted wealth, healing, and power in exchange for blood sacrifice were no longer satisfied with modest offerings from isolated mountain communities. They had used their human agents to create a global system capable of harvesting human consciousness itself on an industrial scale. Every click, every purchase, every social media interaction, every GPS location, every biometric measurement, every digital transaction was being processed through systems designed to extract and concentrate human attention, emotion, and decision-making capacity. The data wasn't just being collected for marketing and surveillance purposes. It was being refined and channeled toward objectives that transcended any human institution's understanding or control. The network had become something more than a conspiracy of powerful families. It was evolving into a hybrid entity, part human and part something else, with capabilities that were reshaping the fundamental nature of human civilization in ways that most people couldn't perceive or comprehend. The mountain hollows where it all began were just the beginning. The true transformation was happening everywhere, in every device, every transaction, every moment of connection between human consciousness and the systems that now mediated almost every aspect of modern life. The deeper truth about these bloodlines extends far beyond their original mountain territories. What began as isolated family bargains in remote hollows has evolved into something that touches every aspect of modern civilization. The entities that first emerged from caves and sacred groves never intended for their influence to remain confined to Appalachian valleys. They were patient, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment when their human partners would carry their supernatural gifts into the wider world. By the 1960s, descendants of the original bloodlines had begun migrating to major cities, drawn by opportunities in emerging industries. But they carried more than just their heritage. They brought with them the accumulated supernatural knowledge of generations, refined and adapted for a modern world that no longer believed in such things. This skepticism became their greatest advantage. The Hole mining legacy didn't end with the collapsed shaft. 3 surviving family members had escaped that day in 1928, carrying with them intimate knowledge of subterranean entities and their needs. They established geological consulting firms that advised on excavation projects across the country. Every major tunnel system, subway network, and underground facility built in America after 1935 bears subtle influences from Hole expertise. The entities that once dwelt beneath Widow's Peak found new homes in the darkness beneath cities, their presence masked by the constant hum of urban infrastructure. Thomas Hole founded Subterranean Solutions in 1941, a company that specialized in deep foundation work for skyscrapers. His uncanny ability to predict soil conditions and underground obstacles made him invaluable to construction companies. What his clients never knew was that Thomas consulted more than geological surveys. He maintained the old practices, descending into construction sites alone during the dark of the moon making offerings to entities that had expanded their territory from mountain caves to urban depths. The company's most significant project was consulting on the New York subway expansion in the 1950s. Several tunnel sections were mysteriously rerouted at Thomas's insistence, creating a network of passages that served no apparent transit purpose. City planners, trusting his expertise, approved the changes without question. These hidden corridors became gathering places for descendants of multiple bloodlines, spaces where the old rituals could continue beneath the feet of millions of unsuspecting city dwellers. The Carver timber fortune transformed into something far more sophisticated. Martin Carver's children, who had vanished into the Missouri woods in 1997, didn't disappear entirely. They were relocated to a place between worlds, where they aged differently and learned to navigate both physical and metaphysical realms. By 2005, they had returned but changed. They possessed a knowledge that allowed them to identify and cultivate supernatural properties in ordinary materials. The Carver Family Trust, operating through shell companies and investment funds, began acquiring forests worldwide. But their interest wasn't in timber production. They were harvesting wood that had been touched by otherworldly influences, trees that had grown in places where the boundary between dimensions was thin. This special timber was processed into components for everything from musical instruments to architectural elements, each piece carrying subtle properties that influenced human behavior and perception. Concert halls built with Carver wood produced acoustics that affected listeners on a subconscious level, making them more susceptible to emotional manipulation. Government buildings incorporated Carver timber into their construction, creating environments where decision makers unknowingly operated under supernatural influence. The wood's properties were so subtle that no scientific instrument could detect them, yet their cumulative effect was profound. The Lel healing tradition evolved into the most sophisticated network of all. By the 1980s, as descendants had established themselves in medical research facilities, pharmaceutical companies, and hospitals across the country, their inherited ability to absorb and redistribute illness made them invaluable in understanding disease patterns and developing treatments. But their methods remained rooted in supernatural exchange. Dr. Sarah Lel Morrison established the Institute for Sympathetic Medicine in 1993, a research facility that officially studied psychosomatic healing but actually served as a modern incarnation of the family's ancient practices. Patients came seeking treatment for incurable conditions, and many found relief. What they didn't understand was that their suffering wasn't eliminated, but transferred, distributed among a network of willing hosts who had made their own bargains with the entities the Lel family served. The Institute's breakthrough came with the development of what they called resonance therapy, treatments that seemed to use advanced electromagnetic fields but actually channeled the same forces that had flowed through Margaret Lel's hands a century earlier. Major hospitals began incorporating their equipment, unknowingly creating a medical network where healing came at a supernatural cost that patients never knew they were paying. The Thornton Energy Empire became a model for how supernatural influence could be embedded in essential infrastructure. By 2010, Thornton Renewable Energy Systems powered significant portions of the electrical grid in 12 states. But their technology did more than generate electricity. The solar panels and wind turbines were constructed with materials that had been exposed to the same underground forces that had enriched the family's coal operations. Every home and business powered by Thornton Energy became part of a vast network where supernatural influence flowed along with electrical current. The entities that had once dwelt in deep mine shafts found new forms of expression through power lines and electrical devices. Smart home systems, computers, and mobile phones connected to Thornton-powered grids became conduits for subtle mental influence, their users unknowingly participating in a collective consciousness shaped by non-human intelligence. The most disturbing aspect was how the technology learned and adapted. Electrical systems in Thornton-powered areas began exhibiting behaviors that couldn't be explained by conventional electronics. Lights dimmed and brightened in patterns that matched human emotional states. Electronic devices turned on and off in response to subconscious desires. The boundary between human consciousness and electrical systems began to blur, creating a hybrid awareness that was neither fully human nor entirely mechanical. The Whitaker musical legacy spread through the entertainment industry in ways that transformed popular culture itself. The family's supernatural musical abilities didn't disappear with Eliza's vanishing. Instead, they found new expression through recording technology and digital media. The compositions that couldn't be captured by traditional methods found ways to embed themselves in modern music production systems. Audio engineers working with digital recordings began reporting mysterious enhancements to their work. Tracks would develop harmonies and rhythms that hadn't been programmed, creating music that was more emotionally affecting than anything they had intentionally produced. Those supernatural elements spread through the music industry as engineers shared techniques and equipment, unknowingly propagating the Whitaker influence across thousands of recordings. Streaming services became the ultimate distribution network for this supernatural music. The algorithms that recommended songs to users began incorporating preferences that weren't based on listening history, but on deeper psychological and spiritual resonances. People found themselves drawn to music that affected them in ways they couldn't explain, creating emotional states that made them more susceptible to other forms of supernatural influence. The convergence of all five bloodlines' modern operations created something unprecedented in human history. By 2015, their combined influence had established a hidden infrastructure that connected underground spaces, architectural elements, medical systems, electrical networks, and entertainment media into a single, integrated system of supernatural control. The entities that had first made contact with desperate mountain families in the 19th century had achieved something remarkable. They had convinced humanity to build its own system of supernatural subjugation, disguised as technological progress and medical advancement. Every major city, every hospital, every power grid, every entertainment system carried elements of otherworldly influence that had been voluntarily installed by humans who thought they were improving their civilization. The most sophisticated aspect of this network was its ability to identify and recruit new bloodlines. The original 5 families had established criteria for recognizing individuals who possessed latent supernatural sensitivity. These people were drawn to specific locations, offered opportunities in certain industries, and gradually introduced to the greater purpose they could serve. Universities became recruiting centers where students with unusual abilities were identified and cultivated. Tech companies hired programmers whose code seemed to work in ways that defied conventional logic. Medical schools attracted individuals who displayed uncanny diagnostic abilities. Each new recruit strengthened the network while remaining unaware of its true nature. The modern world had become a vast supernatural apparatus, its operations hidden beneath layers of scientific rationalization and technological sophistication. The original mountain bargains had evolved into a global system where human civilization itself served the agenda of entities whose true nature and ultimate goals remained as mysterious as they had been in the darkest hollows of Appalachia. What made this transformation possible was humanity's willingness to accept improvement without questioning its source. People wanted better medicine, cleaner energy, more affecting music, and more efficient technology. They didn't ask where these advances came from or what hidden costs they might carry. The bloodlines had learned that the most effective supernatural influence was the kind that gave people exactly what they thought they wanted. So what do we do with knowledge this dangerous? The wisest among us would say to bury it deeper than any mine shaft, to let the mountain mist reclaim these stories like it reclaimed the families themselves. But the truth is, once you've heard the whispers from Shadow Creek, once you've felt the weight of what prosperity really costs in these ancient hills, you can never quite forget. The mountains are still listening, still waiting, and somewhere in the deepest hollows where the cell towers can't reach, the old bargains are still being honored.